Hello, my name is Tanya Foster, and I am thrilled to be a part of the Relationships campaign. The topic of my teaching is trust. Let's begin by talking about what it means to have trust in a relationship. When we have trust in a relationship, we believe it's safe to be vulnerable, we feel safe to be real, to share what is most important to us, whether it's confessing a deep, dark secret or sharing a personal achievement. Distrust in relationships is the opposite. We don't feel safe to be vulnerable or to be real. Trust is something that is earned. It's not wise to be vulnerable with everyone because some people are not safe. They can't be trusted with the things that are most important to us. Many of you have likely heard of the marble jar analogy that Brené Brown uses to explain trust. It goes like this. Trust is like a marble jar. People put marbles in the jar when they do things that make us feel safe, validated, encouraged, comforted, etc. But let's also look at how people can take marbles out of the jar. Have you ever taken a risk to share with a friend a personal struggle you're having, say with depression or maybe overspending or some other vice that you're struggling with, and the friend responds with a lecture? Not only are they not adding marbles to the jar, they are actually taking marbles out of the trust jar. You don't feel safe to share with that person how you're feeling. So what I like to do for the rest of the teaching is to look at how Jesus built trust with others and how we can apply those practices to our lives so we also can flourish in trusted relationships. Jesus did not do life alone. He did life with his disciples. Not only the 12, but the many who traveled with him, ministered with him, worshiped with him, ate with him, stayed with him. We know that it's not easy being in relationships. It wasn't easy being a part of the community of Jesus. His followers gave up material things. They gave up career ambitions. They gave up comforts. They were persecuted and misunderstood. But let's not forget that Jesus was also making sacrifices. He had no home. He was poor. He had no source of revenue except for the generosity of others. He spent his time with some rather dysfunctional people. Being in community is not easy. It's messy. It requires sacrifice, especially the sacrifice of time. And there's always a risk that we're going to invest in a relationship with someone only to have them turn on us. Even though it wasn't easy for the disciples to be in community with Jesus, it was safe. It was safe emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. That doesn't mean that Jesus didn't challenge them. It doesn't mean that he didn't shake up their entire lives, but he created a space that was safe for them in his presence. Let's look at Matthew 11, 28 to 30, a familiar passage that I'm going to read from the Message version. Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me and you will recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you will learn to live freely and lightly. Do you hear Jesus' words? Even though they faced challenging circumstances, they could know rest and peace and freedom in his presence. Can we be people who manifest rest and peace and freedom in our communities? Can we create safe spaces for others to be vulnerable? So we've established that we need to be in community. We can't do life alone. Let's look at how we can cultivate trusted relationships. The first thing we can do to build trust with others is by inviting them to be a part of our lives. We can't cultivate trust with others if we don't create space in our lives for them. Jesus wanted to be in relationship with his disciples. He wanted them to be his followers and his friends. He wanted them to be a part of his life, to be with him. After calling Matthew the tax collector, Jesus and his disciples went to Matthew's house for dinner. Other tax collectors and sinners joined them. No other rabbi would have invited Matthew to follow them or have eaten in Matthew's house. How do you think Matthew felt with Jesus, a man who was willing to eat with a tax collector? I think Matthew felt safe. Matthew had to make some significant changes in his life. He had to give up the wealth he'd gained from his position. He had to break from the Romans. He had to give up certain relationships. I don't know that he could have done this without knowing and feeling that he was part of a safe community. People need to feel safe to change. Do you think Matthew felt safe at the synagogue? I doubt it. And when we invite people to be a part of our lives, when we create space for them in our lives, we're adding marbles to the trust jar. Not only did Jesus invite people to be a part of his life, but he also showed them that he cared about them and about the things they cared about. When Peter's mother-in-law was sick, Jesus healed her. When the disciples were in a boat about to be capsized by a furious storm, Jesus calmed the storm. I remember when my nephew died and then my brother-in-law died. People from this church who had never met them came to the funeral. Charles came, Kathy came. It meant a lot to see them in the chapel. And I remember when people from this church came to celebrate my son's wedding again. Many of them didn't know Caleb and Mandy well, but they came for me. Gary and Mary, I remember Kevin and Ella, Tim and Ashley, and others. And then when I was facing public opposition during my stint in local politics, Andrew came, Kathy came. It gave me so much courage to see Andrew's face among the crowd of protesters. All these people added marbles to the trust jar because they showed up when I was grieving, when I was rejoicing, and when I was scared. Jesus invited people to be a part of his life. He cared about them, and he also invested in their growth through teaching and mentorship. He wanted to see them grow into the people they were created to be. Jesus taught the disciples how to live, how to love people, how to be servants, how to pray, how to minister, how to read and understand the scriptures. They learned from Jesus' teaching, but also by practice. Jesus sent the disciples out to minister in his name, to be his representatives. I think the disciples felt that Jesus believed in them. After all, he gave them authority and commissioned them to go out and do what he was doing. Doesn't it give you confidence when people believe in you, when they cheer you on? We are adding marbles to the jar and we show people that we believe in them and that we're willing to invest in their growth. We don't have to be leaders or teachers to nurture growth in others. We can simply invite people to join us when we're doing acts of service or doing ministry. We can all be mentors to someone. Jesus also invested in his disciples' growth by challenging them when their values were out of sync with the values of the kingdom and by correcting their bad theology. Do you remember when the disciples fought about who would be greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Jesus corrected them. He said, "The rulers of the world do these things, but not so with you." He gave them a higher call, the call of a humble servant. He also corrected James and John when they wanted to call fire down from heaven on a Samaritan village. He rebuked the disciples when they tried to keep the children from coming to him. We see many instances of Jesus correcting Peter. Why? Because Jesus was committed to making Simon Peter the leader of the church. That meant that Jesus had to deal with Peter's bad theology. Do you remember that time that Jesus told the disciples he would be killed but rise again on the third day? Well, he actually said that multiple times, but that one time when Peter took him aside and reprimanded him. And Jesus strongly rebuked Simon Peter. Building trust with others means that we are willing to confront them when they are headed down a path of self-destruction, spiraling into a dark place, drifting into apathy. We must choose courage over comfort, as Brene Brown says. There's always a risk that we will offend people and sever the relationship. And the trust jar may take a hit. That's why it's important to fill the jar with enough marbles that the person is confident that we have their best interests in mind when we correct them. I also want to mention the importance of boundaries. Jesus had boundaries. There were certain lines that Jesus did not allow others to cross. I think of the story of the rich young ruler. He wanted eternal life. He wanted in. He could have been a great asset to the community. He was moral, upstanding. He had a lot of money. But Jesus didn't lower the bar for him. It says that Jesus looked at him and loved him. Then he told the man that he needed to sell everything he had. One final point I want to make is this. Jesus was patient and forgiving with his disciples. Do you remember at the Last Supper, Jesus said to Peter, "Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat, but I have pleaded in prayer for you, Simon, that your faith should not fail. So when you have repented and turned to me again, strengthen your brothers." Jesus knew that Peter was going to blow it. Peter insisted, "No, never, not me. I'm going to go die for you." But Jesus knew. And after Peter's betrayal, Peter could recall those words, "When you have repented and turned back to me." Jesus made a pathway for Peter to be restored. And indeed, Jesus did forgive Peter for the betrayal. We need people in our lives who are going to love us when we've had a grouchy day or we've done something stupid. We're adding marbles to the jar when we love people through their brokenness and failures. I'm going to move to the conclusion. Of course, much more could be said about how Jesus cultivated trust in his relationships, but I'll leave it to you to examine Jesus' life further. But I want to close with a challenge. I want to challenge you all to examine your relationships. Are you in relationships with people you can trust absolutely? Are you in relationships with people who can trust you absolutely? Are you creating space for people to be vulnerable with you, to be real, to fail, to grow? Can you apply the practices of Jesus to your own life so that you can flourish in trusted relationships? Remember that Jesus intended for you to do life in community. Make 2023 a year in which you focus on building healthy, trusted relationships with others. Thank you.